any comments, and we have a couple. I just want to give a run through again with respect to all that has been said by our speakers. So we began with the foundation or the cornerstone upon which all our work hinges, and that is the House of Prayer, where Gabriella and Eilish Coe centered and focused our thinking on the beauty of prayer, the joy of prayer, the necessity of prayer, and how we all can make a difference and contribute to the work in anti-human trafficking in a prayerful way. Thank you both to Eilish and Gabriella. We moved on in the context of Aphrodita's presentation and the value of service learning networks, which you referred to in the context of collaboration and cooperation, particularly with a number of states, with a view to impact of social media on youth and the needs arising from same. Her colleague in the co-presentation also presented in the context of the Always Hope message. And this is from Marie Fran, when she spoke about the particular element of awareness raising that can take place in the event of the traveling photographic exhibition. And she emphasized the positive, hopeful message in the theme, full stop, then on we go. Life can offer more. And it's a particularly important message in the context of the dark side of life that we see in the human trafficking. Imelda shared insights on how traffickers want us to be. I think it's one thing that struck me, how traffickers want us to be. It carries the whole concept of their power over and how they operate on the aspects of fear and lack of hope and despair, which Imelda has emphasized, and that women and children are particularly most vulnerable to. Yvonne moved on and spoke about collaborations in the aspects of capacity building and instance-specific training that has been available for Renate network members in the area of OSEC and IT and technology, and the role it can play both in the negative and the positive aspects of our work. Brian spoke on behalf of the Law Task Group, and he brought the concept of trauma-centered moderation to the fore, the need for trauma-centered moderation to the fore. Obviously, he referred to the use of internet platforms with no limitations, masked as legitimate entities. And of course, that was brought through then in the context of the presentation by Ruth, where Ruth emphasized the need for and the analysis of the technology and technological use, but also making technology as part of the answer. And again, Ruth was bringing this in the context of how Renate can inform policy-driven work and make the voices heard at the Council of Europe through its representation at the Conference of INGOs. Rania and Mariana spoke about shelters and the restoration to new life, with a specific emphasis of using technology for the empowerment of women and girls to participate, to be informed, and also as tools in order to communicate for themselves. And finally, Greta concluded today's presentations with an overview of advocacy and aspects of advocacy that is very focused and that is informed by what we hear from Renate members across the 31 countries. And with over 320 members, that's a lot of information that can come forward. So how do we distill and pool that information in service of the mission of Renate is the key challenge. So thank you to our presenters. It's open to people to raise a question or make a comment. And in doing so, I need you to raise your hand. That's probably the easiest, most direct way. We do have two questions that have been raised already. John McGeady from the Our Lady of the Apostles congregation in Ireland has raised two questions from the floor. The first one, is there a case? Actually, John, if you're still with us, you might like to read it out yourself and raise it with us. Let's see, I'm just going across. There you are, John. So you can unmute yourself, John, and you can raise the question. but you have two questions, and thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today. So over to you, John.
Certainly, thanks very much, Anne. I suppose the first question I had kind of came out of a lot of the discussion about obviously the fact that social media companies and as Dr. McAllister pointed out, websites in general of various kinds are facilitating human trafficking. Is there maybe a case here for advocating for accountability legislation targeted specifically at social media companies? And having heard Dr. McAllister's comments about, maybe having to address the administrators of websites more generally, maybe possibly needs to be broader than that. But the idea that they would need to put in some protocols to identify and report activity on sites where they see any kind of activity that might be facilitating human trafficking. So that's just a question of the floor. It was really more of a thought than anything else. So
thank you, John. Would anybody care to respond to that at the moment?
I'm happy to.
Okay, thank you, Ruth.
John, thanks very much for the question. It's a very valid one, to be honest. Already there is an expectation on social media companies to report suspicion to law enforcement. And that does happen, believe it or not, through some of the bigger companies like Meta, for example. They do have representatives within their company that actually will report directly to law enforcement, and they have law enforcement teams that will do that. Now, we can argue about how successful that is. We probably have our own thoughts on that, to be honest. But just to say, they already do have that within social media, certainly within the online harms bill that is being debated in Parliament in the UK at the minute. There will be a legal obligation on social media companies and websites more generally, so the big tech companies, if you like, to report any harm or risk that is apparent on their websites. So for example, even now ASWs are working more closely with law enforcement, particularly those that investigate organised crime. So for example, the likes of regional organised crime units within the UK, for example, they're now providing these law enforcement agencies with details and information around suspicion that they believe is happening on their websites. And they actually have worked together with the National Crime Agency to develop a matrix of what actually is trafficking compared to, if you like, standard compliant sex work on their platforms. And that's really to get them into the way of reporting whenever they have the legal obligation to do so under the Online Harms Act, whenever it is introduced, hopefully early next year. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. How successful this will be, I have no idea. It hasn't worked in the past, but let's be optimistic.
Thank you, Ruth. And John had a second question that we'll stay with you, John, if we may, in the context of the second question that you have raised.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ruth. That's kind of a very clear answer. And maybe you might just come in again on that. Maybe just that there's obviously a UK bill there. Can I ask, is there anything similar on the European Parliament front?
There has been a little bit of work done around the Digital Services Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, John, or not. If not, it might be worth having a look at that, but that's only very recent legislation as well. But I would definitely recommend that, because there has been some arguments around how effective that will be vis-a-vis online harms. So again, all the outworkings are still going on, and it's not actually enforceable just yet. There is some time for EU countries to really come on board with that. It only happened a few months ago, so it's still relatively fresh. So definitely take a look and by all means compare the two and see how it may work out for the rest of Europe as well.
Okay. And then the second question that Anne asked me to, or invited me to say, it's in the chat, anybody who's looking at it, is just in terms of good quality data. That idea of good quality data was brought up, I think, by Brian. I was just thinking about the idea of good quality data being reported by governments. And again, this is just for the floor, this is just my own thinking as I was listening. Is there any studies being done that interrogates to what extent governments are actually providing good quality data? In terms of both the scope of their data, the reliability of their data. I don't know if anybody we'll be able to answer that, but that's just a kind of a broad question maybe for all the speakers on that one is, is there anything going on at the minute that's actually interrogating whether governments are really providing good quality data in the reports?
I can give maybe a little bit of an answer that might help in terms of the work that the Law Task Group are doing in terms of their own research in an attempt to try and discover what data is available and to discover what studies produce data that might be relevant, and in what country and in what context that the data is produced. It very much depends. The first study we did across two different sides of Europe, the eastern side and the western side, and the differences in the data was very obvious in terms of what was recorded and what wasn't recorded. But one thing that we found that really kind of upset the trend of available data was the inability, or perhaps the lack of willingness, to identify victims. It became very, very difficult to identify victims. So if you can't identify, or perhaps won't identify victims, which some countries are saying is actually happening, or some advocates are saying is happening, that there is an unwillingness to identify, because once you identify a victim, all of the entitlements become theirs, and it becomes an expense, it becomes a worry, it becomes a concern. And what we have noticed in particular, for example, with regards to the UK, is that where there is a hostility of welcome, there is a conflation between migrancy and or migration and human trafficking, and all of a sudden there are less people being identified as being victims of human trafficking. There are reliable sources, UNODC, there's the TIP, but there's local, there's also SDG stuff, but none of the pictures are clear. And the problem that I think is apparent, and we have faced this in one of the studies, is that you're getting fragmented, you're getting a little snapshot of this, a little snapshot of that, and what's happening is that it's incomparable and it's incompatible with each other. So it makes it very difficult to reach a conclusion, or to make a conclusion, or to draw a conclusion of sorts. And what is apparent is that there is no uniform gathering of data as would be able to create policy or to identify gaps across large regions or large swathes. There is a large gap, and there seems to be an unwillingness to attempt to source quality disaggregated data that will attempt to make the difference in this case. That's just from the experience within the Law Task Group in terms of trying to get data with regards to some of the studies that we're doing. And in actual fact, some of what we're doing identifies gaps, and part of our recommendations is around creating new data, or creating a situation that might create further data that might be of use to protect and do some other work later on. So that, I'm afraid that's all I can offer, John.
Thank you, Brian. That's very helpful. I see that Yvonne's hand is up as well in response. Over to you, Yvonne, if you can unmute.
I just wanted to mention the national rapporteurs that do great jobs in this, of course. And what I think is also very good data is the Greta reports that are done per country. So the Greta consultants, I think you can call them, they visit the countries and they speak to all the stakeholders, and they make a report per country. So that, I think, gives good data.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Or at least data that you can compare.
Yeah, I'm going to look across the screens just to see if there's any more hands up in that regard. No. Now, I would thank you for raising those 2 points, John, and certainly they will inform our own discussions down the line at Renate, and in future collaborations as well too. So particularly helpful to focus our thinking. Thanks, John. Any comments from anybody, or any questions that anybody would like to raise? And if so, now is your chance. Okay, Imelda has her hand up. Over to you, Imelda.
This is addressed to Rania and Mariana in particular. I've been consciously aware that in data that we collect in Europe, that there's a huge increase really in the percentage of internal trafficked victims ending in shelters rather than cross-border trafficked victims, and also the data's revealing that there are a lot more minors in shelters than maybe at the beginning of this pandemic, you might say, or explosion of trafficking. So I'd just like Rania and Marianne, if you could talk about this in relation to IT really, because it makes a huge difference, I would have thought, if this is the case for them. And recruiting, I was thinking of the recruiting process and so on.
Okay, thanks, Imelda. So Rania and Mariana.
Okay, Mariana, would you like to answer or do I proceed?
Okay, I can start, and so I can say that we based these statistics on the cases that are identified and referred for assistance, and what we see within our country is in the same line what Imelda expressed, that it is increase the cases that are identified within the country, and especially between those that are identified, more than 60% are minors. I can say that for Albania, for example, it's increased the number of cases identified within the country, even due to outreach work that mobile teams are doing for identification of the cases. So they are increased the efforts for proactive identification of the cases within the country. Besides that, what we see is that not many cases that are trafficked in other destination countries like EU countries are coming back in Albania. And we do not have like a clear picture of how many cases in each of these countries, for example, from Albania, are trafficked. So we have for those cases that are assisted and returned in our country through the cooperation with institutions in these countries. But so for internal or international trafficking, I must say that is true, that is increased internal trafficking compared with international trafficking, but still we need to do some more to gather some more data from the destination countries in order to have a clearer picture for our cases. And for minors, that is true, that even cases that when they come in shelter are adults, when they were trafficked, they were minors. So this is a huge problem that we all need to address. So Rania.
Thank you, Mariana. I also agree that for us, we don't have that much data so that we can conclude and to safe conclusions. We in our safe house, we don't have like minors who have been trafficked. We just have minors as children of women who have been trafficked. Most of them are refugees, and the countries of origin is usually Africa, and Middle East. So we don't have that much of how to say, not elements, like information for us to conclude safe results.
Okay, thank you, Rania, and thank you, Mariana. Thank you both. Just looking across the pages here, I don't see any further hands up, which I'm relieved about, because we're going to run out of time shortly and I don't want us to be cut off. It's nicer when we can power down ourselves. And may I take this opportunity then to express my gratitude to all of you for coming online today, and in particular to the colleagues in the Renate Network who have prepared the information, refined it down and kept to task today. I hope that you will have found it informative and inspirational in the context of the work that you are doing individually yourselves and collectively, and invite you to support the Renate Network as best you can. Together, we are stronger in our work when we work collaboratively and collegially. I'd like to express finally our thanks to our hosts hosts at this virtual booth, the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd at the UN, another instance of collaboration, and that has worked with us in the context of previous CSWs, and we're very grateful. In fact, actually, aren't we fortunate that we don't all have to flock off to New York, that we actually can use the technology for our purposes here in the positive yet again. So on that positive note, may I wish you all a very happy morning, afternoon and evening, and stay safe and well. Thank you all.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.